In September 1989, two brothers, 10-year-old Billy and 11-year-old Cole Neer, went missing while playing in David Douglas Park in Washington State.
With these little boys, these crimes are so horrible. I just shudder to even think about it.
The following month, in the neighboring state of Oregon, 4-year-old Lee Isley was abducted from his local play area. His body was discovered almost 4 weeks later.
And I knew at that moment, I go, my God, what am I gonna do? I'm afraid every minute of the day, another dead kid.
The killer was 28-year-old Wesley Allen Dodd. The unassuming shipping clerk had been abusing children for over 10 years and was ready to tell all to investigators.
You have the right to remain silent. You understand that? Yes.
And he actually built a torture rack tied with ropes that were all ready to tie the next victim down and basically torture them.
I got rubbed this back. I thought, I wish I didn't have to do this. Well, see what's a nice kid.
Wesley Allen Dodd had confessed to being one of the world's most evil killers. The crimes of Wesley Allen Dodd shocked even the most seasoned of detectives. When the 28-year-old confessed to 3 sickening murders, it was hard for psychoanalyst Dr. Ronald Turco to imagine Dodd was capable of such depravity.
If you met this person at the gym or in the street and spoke with him, you would have no idea that he was dangerous in any way or in any way had a sexual deviation, let alone be a killer.
Homicide detective C.W. Jensen, who investigated Dodd, had a similar opinion of him.
He was a nobody, and Wesley Allen Dodd would have passed through this world with no one ever noticing him, except for that he was an evil deviant.
Dodd's stunning confessions were confirmed by a horrific diary, which he kept under lock and key.
Wesley Allen Dodd doesn't have the body count of, say, Stalin, but in his heart, he was just as bad.
This killer's story begins in the Pacific Northwest.
Wesley Dodd was born on the 3rd of July, 1961, in a place called Toppenish in Washington State.
He was kind of a geek. He wasn't real popular, but there was nothing out of the ordinary in his life.
He had a brother and a sister, and they were the favorite in the family. He was not close to his siblings.
The family moved around a lot during Dodd's childhood.
His father had a series of jobs. He'd had some health issues. His mother was going out to work. There was a lot of arguing in the family.
Dodd's home life was seemingly chaotic. In 1970, when he was 9, he had an uncomfortable moment in front of his aunts.
And he had to change his clothes in front of them and was seen in his underwear. He had never forgotten this. It was a trauma for him. He was very much embarrassed.
With a transient family life, Dodd never seemed to settle down. He was often moving schools and struggled to fit in wherever he went.
He wasn't a particularly happy child. He was a loner.
And he played in the high school band. But he did well with the clarinet. With regard to relationships to other people and band members, very little emotional interaction.
He struggled with his sexuality.
Dodd recognized from a young age that he was attracted to boys. small boys.
If you're that way at 11, you're going to be that way at 31.
As he hit adolescence, Dodd began to explore his unnatural fantasies. In May 1975, aged just 13, he began flashing at younger children in the neighborhood.
He does it from his bedroom window, and the kids go home and go, Wesley's exposing himself to us as we walk by his house.
If you are exposing yourself, what you are actually enjoying is the look of shock and fear on the victims' faces. Why would somebody be enjoying that? That should be problematic to us, that this is how they get their kicks, if you like.
Parents of the children reported this activity to the police, who then paid a visit to the Dodd house in July 1975. They spoke to Dodd's father, but ultimately no further action was taken.
The authorities looked upon this as less than relevant. He used that because he knew they're not going to do anything. And that was the first step in what became a progression of sexual activity with children.
He was a genuinely malevolent force because he focused his interests on tiny, completely innocent children.
Nobody's really stopping him. Nobody's giving him a strong message that this is absolutely unacceptable. He's almost trained himself that this is the way to behave, and he's starting to really enjoy it.
During his formative years, Dodd was often in trouble with the police for indecent exposure. As he matured into adulthood, his deviant urges showed no signs of slowing down. In September 1981, Dodd enlisted in the Navy, but continued to offend whenever he found an opportunity.
He continues to sexually abuse young children, and he doesn't even seem to be particularly concerned that anybody's going to hold him to account. But this time, he's a man, he's not a child himself.
Dodd was arrested in December 1982 for attempting indecent liberties on a boy, and this time was dishonorably discharged from the Navy.
He was ordered to counseling 3 or 4 different times, including the time he was discharged from the Navy. The counseling was never helpful.
In 1984, Dodd was arrested yet again for molesting a 10-year-old boy, but only received a 1-year suspended sentence. Later that year, he was convicted for molesting a 13-year-old boy. This time, the 23-year-old received a 10-year sentence, but he was soon a free man.
That sentence was reduced to just 4 months. And the reason given was that he made a very good account of himself in court. And that suggests, of course, that he is potentially a highly manipulative individual. That fits with most pedophiles. They do learn very, very quickly how to present themselves in a way that's going to get them exactly what they want.
It wasn't long before Dodd was once again in trouble with the authorities. In June 1987, the 25-year-old approached a young boy on the streets of Seattle.
Dodd attempted to abduct a boy and take him to a derelict building. The boy objected violently and ran off. But of course he could identify Dodd, and it didn't take very long indeed for the police to track Dodd down and arrest him for the charge.
Wesley Allen Dodd was back behind bars for now. When he sat down for an interview with detectives, The 25-year-old wasn't going to deny the allegations. In fact, Dodd's confession would chill investigators to the bone. In June 1987, Wesley Allen Dodd was arrested for trying to lure a child into an abandoned building. The case landed on the desk of Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Anne Bremner.
I first heard the name Wesley Allen Dodd when I was assigned his case for trial. I had a note from my supervisor, Becky Rowe, that said, and I can still remember it to this day, she wrote, "Anne, get this guy, he's scary."
Our team's goal in this case was to convict him of the highest charge possible and put him in prison for as long as we could, which at that time under the charge that we had would have been 5 years. That would have been the maximum. He was incredibly dangerous, probably the most dangerous I'd seen up to that time. And he needed to be locked up as long as we could lock him up.
But when Anne Bremner met Dodd for the first time, he didn't look like the dangerous predator she'd been warned about.
Wesley Dodd was a very kind of slight, non-imposing person. He could look to be non-threatening to a child, just in his stature and in his affects. He almost like kind of faded into the wall kind of person. He was timid, but creepy, at the same time.
The arrest report gave a shocking insight into Dodd's depravity.
This little boy was living with his mom in a motel on Aurora Avenue in Seattle. Some of the area was high for prostitution, drug dealing, things like that, but it was not a great place for a little boy to be. And so Wesley Dodd approached him.
This little boy, who I think was only 8 or 9, said no, went home, told his parents. They called the police.
The boy identified him on the street because he hung around.
It's kind of remarkable that this boy sensed that there was something wrong with this guy who had been befriending him.
It was Dodd's ensuing interview with detectives that stunned the two prosecutors the most.
He said, I wanted to touch him sexually and have him touch me. Why did he just give this full confession? I've just never seen that in my sex cases. Somebody that just felt proud of what he was going to do.
Dodd's confession was remarkable. Usually we were left to try to make arguments based on a pattern of conduct that this is what this person is gonna go and do in the future if you don't lock him up. But this guy's like telling you what he's gonna do if he's not locked up.
The prosecutors filed for attempted kidnapping in the first degree, which was the highest possible charge they could impose on Dodd.
We alleged attempting kidnap, which was trying to lure him away for purposes of committing a crime, a sexual assault.
But the problem with the case is that the building where he wanted to go with the boy was not a place where he could hide the little boy. And so that was a problem because kidnapping requires that the child be taken to a place where they cannot be found. What the judge found was, regardless of his intentions and his confession, he still was going to take him in a place where the child could be found.
Because of the legal aspects, the judge was obligated to require evidence of Dodd's intention.
The judge said that Dodd needed to have said something to the little boy along the lines of intending to do something sexual before the confession could be admitted.
The verdict happened with the judge. Judge says this is not a felony, it's a gross misdemeanor.
The judge also ordered him into counseling, which at that point in time would have seemed, frankly, silly and futile to me, given what this guy said in his confession.
After his probation period came to an end, 27-year-old Wesley Dodd abandoned his counseling sessions and relocated to Vancouver, Washington, where he found work as a shipping clerk. Despite a long list of felonies, Dodd was a free man. On Labor Day 1989, at David Douglas Park in Vancouver, Washington, two brothers were enjoying a day off school.
On the 4th of September, two boys, Cole and Billy Neer, were playing in the park.
Away from their parents, 10-year-old Billy and 11-year-old Cole were lured to a secluded area by a stranger.
They were riding their bikes, and he asked them in an authoritative fashion to come with him into the woods. And then he brought them in, and he asked them to drop their pants. They didn't want to do it. And the older boy was very concerned, very frightened. He eventually got his clothes off, but the children were resisting.
He tied him with shoestrings. The older brother could have run away, but he wouldn't leave his brother.
After assaulting both children, the attacker wasn't finished. He produced a knife and began to stab them repeatedly.
This is a horrific crime. It's a sexual attack on boys aged 10 and 11 in a public park in broad daylight when they're literally only a few hundred yards from their own home. It is the most disgraceful, depraved crime you can imagine.
Thinking that he'd killed both brothers, the assailant fled the scene. At 2 a.m. the following morning, 11-year-old Cole's body was discovered in the park. 10-year-old Billy was found soon after the attack, still fighting for his life.
He's rushed to hospital, but sadly dies on the way.
The offender wasn't identified. Two children had been killed in broad daylight, and the attacker had got away, leaving no obvious clues.
They were just normal people out for a holiday, and these poor kids ran into the worst person at the worst time.
8 weeks later, on the 29th of October 1989, 15 miles from the murder of the Neer brothers, across the state border in Portland, Oregon, 4-year-old Lee Isley was playing with his older brother.
Lee is playing on a slide in the park. His brother is riding his bike.
Lee kind of wandered off on his own, and then he was gone.
When Lee's family discovered he was missing, police and the media immediately launched a search for the boy. Homicide detective C.W. Jensen was hoping it was a case he wouldn't have to work on.
I was eating breakfast, and I'm reading the newspaper about a missing 4-year-old boy. He had his picture in there, and I looked at my wife, and I said, "This is going to be horrible." I go, "This kid is dead." And she goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "He disappeared yesterday afternoon." I go, "It's either he's been kidnapped, killed, or he's fallen in something." I said, "I am so glad I'll have no part of this thing." And 2 hours later, it became the center of my world.
On the 1st of November, 3 days after his disappearance, the body of Lee Isley was discovered by a hunter near Vancouver Lake in Washington. He was just 4 years old. Detective Jensen was called to the crime scene.
By the time I got there, the news crews were starting. We had them back pretty far, but news crews are getting there and a lot of people watching. And I can remember walking up to the body. It was the first time I looked at him and I realized he looks like my daughter. Exactly. You got to figure it out. You got to make it happen. Got to work. Got to find out who did it. More kids are going to die.
At the time of this particular case, I was a detective with the Newburgh Police Department, and I worked child kidnap, child molestation, other child murder, and so on. So when this case came up, I was asked by the Portland police to become involved, and I became a part of the multi-agency task force.
And I knew there was more dead kids coming. So I called him up and I go, "Hey, Ron, FBI can't help me. Can you help me?"
Dr. Ronald Turco put together a profile of who the likely offender would be.
Mid to late 20s, would have a strong history of sexual deviation, both exposure as well as actual contact with children, that he was very clever, that he was going to be very careful, and initially he was probably committing sexual crimes without violence, but obviously there was an escalation of violence which was going to continue.
With Lee's body now recovered, investigators could try and discover what had happened to him.
So when we looked at the autopsy pictures, we could see rope, the ligatures around the neck, and other parts of his body.
There was also clear evidence of sexual assault.
I went to the autopsy, and I've been to a bunch of autopsies. Lee's post-mortem examination was reverential. It was almost like a religious service. The silence. The doctor, he was so gentle. He was just so good to him, so gentle with him. His little hair. And I knew at that moment, I go, my God, what am I going to do? Just the gravity of everything.
It was critical Detective Jensen found the person responsible fast, but there wasn't enough evidence to progress the investigation, even with an eyewitness statement from Lee's older brother.
It wasn't real clear. You had this story from the brother about Lee being around a dude in the schoolyard. It's murky. This thing is exploding in the newspaper. Once it's in the paper or on the media, you get all these calls, and you got to do something with them.
It was only a matter of time before the insatiable murderer struck again.
He was never, ever going to stop. He had to be stopped.
He was going to kill the next child. There's no question about that. No question in his mind, no question in my mind.
When you don't know what to do, you do anything. And we didn't know what to do, and we were doing everything. I'm afraid every minute of the day for another dead kid.
Time was of the essence. Every second Lee's attacker was out there, no child was safe. But fortunately for detectives, the killer was about to make a big mistake. In November 1989, a child killer was on the loose in the Pacific Northwest. The investigation was ongoing, and many suspects were questioned. But 4-year-old Lee Isley's attacker still hadn't been identified.
They have what's called a cooling off period in between all of their murders. They get to this point where they've got to kill someone, they really want to do it. But after they've killed them, they get a sense of relief and they come back down.
Less than 2 weeks after Lee's murder, a woman, accompanied by her boyfriend, took her son to see a movie.
On the 13th of November 1989, a 6-year-old boy goes to the men's room in a theatre in Camas in Washington, about 12 miles east of Vancouver, and is abducted by a man who grabs him in the men's room and carries him through the movie theatre out into the foyer.
The child was very strong, started fighting with him. They picked the child up. He's, come on, let's go. I'm going to take you for a ride. And the child was screaming all the way out, but the boyfriend began to look for the child and put 2 and 2 together. The child wasn't in the bathroom. He heard a child being carried out, so he went out and looked around.
The abductor fled the theatre, but his car broke down before he could leave the area.
Well, the boyfriend walks up and says, can I help? You've got a problem with your car.
Realizing something was far from normal, the boyfriend put the would-be abductor in a headlock and held on until the police arrived.
I think I was watching football, having a beer at home, and my partner calls me, and he said, Camas PD just grabbed a guy, tried to grab a little boy in the movie theater. He goes, we should go talk to him.
Detective Jensen arrived at the police station, ready to interview the suspect. The man in front of him was identified as Wesley Allen Dodd.
Wesley Allen Dodd is a geek, so don't look for some horrible Marvel action villain to get your kid. Your kid is grabbed by a 5'7" geek, little pencil neck. That's your evil people. They're everywhere. Well, Wesley was happy to tell me about the minor, at least in the judicial system, minor things he did with kids. You know, at the very end, one of the last things he said was, I abused kids, I would never hurt a kid. You know, it's just pleasantries. And then what's the deal on the movie theater? And then we talked a little bit about, well, I mean, have you done this before?
Dodd began to confess to the murder of Lee Isley, going into horrific detail about the 4-year-old's final moments.
Where he proceeded to put the 4-year-old boy through the most horrifying ordeal imaginable. He stripped him of his clothes and he tied him to the bed. He then proceeded to assault him, sexually assault him, repeatedly, and took pictures of the boy and of his assaults as trophies of what he'd done.
The sickening ordeal continued into the following day.
Eventually, he decided if he was going to go to work, he couldn't have a witness.
In a display of grotesque depravity, Dodd strangled Lee Isley to death.
If a killer uses more violence than is necessary to kill someone, or if that killer prolongs the suffering of their victim, that means they are actually enjoying the process of hurting and killing them. So they are sadists. Sadists enjoy hurting.
He burnt the clothes and he put Lee's body in a black plastic garbage bag and dumped it near Vancouver Lake, just like the rubbish.
It was a horrendous admission, but Wesley Allen Dodd was only just getting going. Without prompt, he suddenly also confessed to raping and murdering Cole and Billy Neer on Labor Day in Vancouver, Washington.
I had just gotten to the point where I believed he killed Lee Isley. Now he's admitted to everybody. And I kind of glanced at my partner like, I couldn't believe it, because Vancouver police thought they had the suspect in the Neer brothers' killing.
Ronald Turco also had the opportunity to sit down and interview Dodd.
I showed him my badge. I said, you're under arrest. I'm a homicide detective. I'm here to talk with you. And I read his rights.
You have the right to remain silent. You understand that?
Yes.
He didn't seem like much, but he seemed like what I suspected would be the killer. It's sort of a nondescript, run-of-the-mill kind of guy. Nothing special. He spoke in a very bland way.
When did you make the conscious decision you're going to have to kill him?
So 3 o'clock in the morning, I figured probably around 5:30 or so I have to kill him.
Have you already decided how you're going to do it at that time?
Yeah, I decided that's what I had choking. He was laying on top of me, and I was holding him. I got rubbed his back. I thought, I wish I didn't have to do this. It was up my skin.
Investigators knew a confession alone wouldn't guarantee a conviction. They needed hard evidence. They made the decision to get a warrant to search Dodd's apartment, which suddenly caused a shift in the 28-year-old's demeanor.
His head starts to go down. It may have been a tear. And he goes, on my keychain, there's a key. It unlocks a briefcase under my bed. And in there, you'll find things about Lee and the other boys.
As officers entered Dodd's home, they had no idea what they might find. With key in hand, they slowly unlocked the briefcase under his bed, and the true extent of Wesley Allen Dodd's depravity was finally revealed. Hidden under lock and key at his home in Vancouver, Washington, detectives discovered that Wesley Allen Dodd had been keeping a diary documenting his life of sexual deviancy since his childhood.
When detectives went to search Dodd's apartment, they found, horrifyingly, Lee Isley's underpants, a whole series of pictures of Lee and other victims in an album marked Memories.
He had a whole series of photographs. That was part of his diary. He had them clipped in. And then in detail, he wrote about specifically how the murders occurred, what he did, and what he was going to do next.
These are his proudest moments. He achieved something. For Wesley Allen Dodd, his dream was killing little boys. His work that he was proud of, he wrote down. And it was all about abusing children. That was his goal. That was what he lived for. That is what he is proud of. That is what he memorialized in his pathetic little life.
Within those diaries were his plans for future attacks. This guy is incredibly determined, and he's enjoying what he's doing. There's no remorse or shame or guilt. There's just, I need to repeat this because I enjoy this.
In August of 1989, he begins writing about a pact with the devil, and he actually asks Satan to help him. This is the kind of delusion that he has. It's not a psychotic delusion. He knows it's not real, but he's using everything that he can to commit murder or molestation.
The diary revealed how Dodd had tormented helpless 4-year-old Lee Isley.
with Lee, he would strangle him till he passed out. He would bring him back. I mean, he basically tortured this little kid for several hours.
Investigators searching Wesley Dodd's apartment discovered even more disturbing artifacts.
He actually built a torture rack we found in the apartment. He put together with wood boards tied with ropes that were all ready to tie the next victim down and basically torture them.
Dodd had taken photographs of his victims and he had taken trophies as well. He wanted to relive those moments, and he was making sure that he could.
After the horrific discoveries at his home, Wesley Allen Dodd was charged with murder and attempted abduction.
I said, get someone to take him to jail. I don't want to look at him. I don't want to see him till I have to. And I said, I can't wait to take a shower. It's going to be a long one. I said, I've never felt more filthy in my life than I do right now, being with him.
Dodd's trial for the murders of Cole Neer, Billy Neer and Lee Isley, as well as the attempted murder of the 6-year-old boy he tried to abduct from the movie theater, began in May 1990 at the Clark County Superior Court. Despite his earlier confessions, Dodd pled not guilty to all the charges.
We were pretty well prepared. I mean, the defense did the best they could, but it was, a fait accompli that he was guilty.
He was, as usual, bland, not responsive, seemed to be interested in what was going on, about as interested as you might be in maybe watching a movie.
Even without his confessions, the evidence against Dodd was overwhelming, and in June 1990, he changed his plea to guilty. On July the 14th, a jury concluded that he should be sentenced to death. During his time on death row, Dodd astonishingly launched a safety campaign for children.
He went on this one-man redemption tour where it was like, I'm a really awful person, so tell your kids not to talk to awful people like me. I don't need to hear that from you, Wes. Be careful with your kids around strangers. But he went on this media tour from jail, and of course the reporters were only too happy to do the story. And so he enjoyed that bit of notoriety.
Dodd even produced a leaflet to help parents keep their children away from predators like himself.
He writes a leaflet saying that he has this special insight in how to keep children safe. And he's almost saying that he's doing this as some kind of atonement. There's nothing in there that has the slightest bit of insight. It's all of the safety advice that we have been giving to children for years. But what he's actually done is he's kept up that communication with children even behind bars, because that's all he lives for. And that's the most outrageous, egregious thing I've ever seen, that he was able to get that out of the prison walls at all.
In January 1993, it was time for Dodd to pay the ultimate price for his crimes. Reporters gathered at Washington State Penitentiary to witness the execution. Dodd's father said, "Of course I still love Wes. He's my son. But my love for him doesn't alter the facts of what he's done. He's guilty of a horrible crime and should pay the penalty prescribed by law."
I probably could have gone to the execution. I don't know. I put him there. What's the point of seeing him there? I did my job. You guys do your job. But that being said, you show me a guy that kills little kids, kill him.
Just after midnight on the 5th of January 1993, 31-year-old Wesley Allen Dodd was executed by hanging.
Dodd was given the opportunity of choosing between a lethal injection or hanging. Dodd chose to be hanged because he'd hanged Lee Isley in his closet in his apartment. Very measured, very Dodd, all carefully calculated. Okay, well, if I'm going to die, I want to die in the way I choose.
So he's gone, but he went out his way.
Dodd's execution meant that parents across the Pacific Northwest could sleep a little easier. Had he been stopped sooner, 3 children would not have been taken so young.
I've never had a case that had the unique blend of somebody stating their intent to committing these crimes if they weren't locked up. You know, he had enough self-awareness of how evil he was. We did everything that we could have done to try to stop him within our law.
These crimes were so horrible with these little boys. I just shudder to even think about it. It's just the worst I've seen in my entire career. And I've, prosecuted murder cases, sexual assault cases, death cases. He was about as scary as they come.
Dodd was an absolutely unrepentant paedophile who, had he not been caught, almost by accident in that movie theatre in Camas, would have gone on to rape and kill other boys.
The case was so disturbing for C.W. Jensen that the crimes of Wesley Allen Dodd remain a nightmare that will haunt him forever.
I left homicide a little over a year after Lee Isley case. I would think, please don't give me another kid. I'll take anything, no more kids. And I said, I'm done. When you talk about evil people, it's a gradient. It's subjective. But you got to be a sleazebag to kill little kids. It's not body count. It's just the evil and the malice that comes with it. He wasn't the scariest guy I ever met, but he was the worst guy I ever met.
Dodd was a twisted pedophile who could not control his unnatural urges. His crimes escalated from flashing to kidnap, and ultimately from torture to murder. His shocking confessions will live long in the memory of the detectives who interrogated him, while he spoke candidly about killing 3 innocent victims whose lives he took away before they'd had the chance to begin. Wesley Allen Dodd is undoubtedly one of the world's most evil killers.